The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as Thomas Wright stood at attention outside the main entrance. He had been a royal guard for 12 years, and in all that time he had never broken protocol. His black uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his face remained expressionless as tourists snapped photos from behind the iron gates. Thomas knew the rules by heart. Royal guards were supposed to be like statues, unmoving and silent. They represented discipline, tradition, and the unwavering protection of the royal family. Breaking these rules meant dishonor, possible dismissal, and letting down centuries of tradition. Every guard understood this from their first day of training. But on this particular Tuesday morning, something happened that would change everything Thomas thought he knew about duty and service. It started like any other day. The morning shift had just begun, and Thomas took his position alongside his fellow guard, Marcus Chen. They had worked together for years, standing side by side through rain, snow, and blazing summer heat. They rarely spoke during their shifts, but they understood each other perfectly. The palace was preparing for a small family gathering that afternoon. Queen Eleanor was hosting a tea party for her grandchildren, and the staff had been bustling around all morning making preparations. Thomas could see florists carrying arrangements of white roses through the side entrance, and the kitchen staff had been bringing in supplies since dawn. It was meant to be a private, peaceful afternoon for the royal family. Around 10 o'clock, Thomas noticed a young woman approaching the palace gates. She was in her early 30s, wearing a simple blue dress, and she was pushing a wheelchair. In the wheelchair sat an elderly woman, probably in her 80s, wrapped in a shawl despite the warm weather. The younger woman seemed nervous, constantly adjusting the blanket over the older woman's lap and checking a piece of paper in her hand. They stopped about 20 feet from where Thomas stood. The younger woman bent down, speaking softly to the elderly woman in the wheelchair. Thomas could not hear their conversation, but he could see tears rolling down the older woman's weathered cheeks. She was staring at the palace with an expression that mixed joy and sadness in equal measure. For the next 10 minutes, they stayed there. The younger woman took out her phone and snapped a few photos, but the elderly woman barely seemed to notice. She just kept staring at the palace, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes with a trembling hand. Thomas maintained his position, but he found himself watching them from the corner of his eye. The elderly woman began speaking, her voice weak but carrying across the quiet morning air. She was telling stories, Thomas realized. Stories about the palace, about the queen, about days gone by. The younger woman listened patiently, nodding and occasionally squeezing her shoulder. Then Thomas heard something that made his heart skip a beat. "I worked here for 40 years, the elderly woman said, her voice breaking. Right there in the kitchen. I made the queen's breakfast every morning. She always thanked me by name. Always. Even when she was rushing to important meetings, she would stop and say, 'Thank you, Margaret. This looks wonderful.' I never thought I would see this place again." Thomas felt something shift inside him. This was not just another tourist taking photos. This was someone who had devoted her life to serving the royal family, and she had come back one last time. The way she spoke, the way she looked at the palace, told Thomas everything he needed to know. This was probably her final visit. The younger woman, who Thomas assumed was Margaret's daughter or granddaughter, was trying hard not to cry. She kept taking deep breaths and forcing smiles, but her eyes were red. She bent down again and said something quietly to Margaret. The old woman nodded slowly, and they began to turn the wheelchair around. That was when Thomas made a decision that went against everything he had been trained to do. He could not let them leave like this, not without doing something. But he also could not simply abandon his post and walk over to them. That would be a serious breach of protocol. He needed to think quickly. Thomas remained perfectly still, but he caught Marcus's attention with the slightest movement of his eyes. Marcus noticed immediately. After working together for so long, they had developed their own silent language. Marcus followed Thomas's gaze and saw Margaret and her companion preparing to leave. For a moment, Marcus looked confused, but then he seemed to understand. What happened next would become one of those moments that nobody present would ever forget. As Margaret's wheelchair began to move away, Thomas did something he had never done while on duty. He moved. Not much, just the slightest turn of his head, and then he did something even more remarkable. He spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am," Thomas called out, his voice clear and respectful. "Would you mind waiting just one moment?" Both women turned around shocked. Tourists nearby stopped taking photos, confused by what they were witnessing. A royal guard was speaking. A royal guard was breaking formation. This never happened. The younger woman looked worried, probably thinking they had done something wrong. Thomas maintained his composure. He looked straight ahead as guards were supposed to do, but he spoke again. "I need to send a message inside. Please wait." "Just a few minutes." Marcus understood immediately what Thomas was trying to do. Without a word, Marcus stepped back from his position and quickly walked to the guard station just inside the gates. He picked up the internal phone and made a call that would change the course of this ordinary Tuesday morning. Inside the palace, the staff were in the middle of preparations when the call came through. At first, there was confusion. Why was a guard calling about an elderly visitor? But when Marcus explained the situation, something remarkable happened. The message was passed along, from the guard station to the head of security, from security to the Queen's private secretary, and finally to Queen Eleanor herself. Queen Eleanor was in her private sitting room, reviewing the menu for the afternoon tea when her secretary knocked and entered. After a brief conversation, the Queen stood up, set down her papers, and made a decision that would remind everyone why she was so deeply loved by those who knew her best. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Margaret and her companion waited. Confused and uncertain, Thomas had returned to his rigid stance, staring straight ahead as if nothing had happened, but inside his heart was racing. He had broken protocol, and he did not know if his gamble would pay off. He had simply acted on instinct, on a feeling that this moment mattered more than rules. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The younger woman was about to suggest they leave when something extraordinary happened at the palace gates. The palace gates began to open slowly, their ancient hinges creaking softly in the morning air. Margaret gasped, her wrinkled hand flying to her mouth. Her companion froze, gripping the wheelchair handles tightly. This was not something that happened for ordinary visitors. The gates of the palace only opened for official business, for members of the royal family, or for specially invited guests. A woman in a neat gray suit emerged from the gates, walking with purpose but also with a warm smile on her face. She was Catherine Mills, one of the Queen's senior staff members, and she had worked at the palace for 20 years. She approached Margaret's wheelchair directly, her smile growing wider as she got closer. "Mrs. Margaret Davies?" Catherine asked gently, already knowing the answer. "I believe you once worked in our kitchens. Is that correct?" Margaret could barely speak. She nodded, tears streaming down her face freely now. "Yes," she whispered. "For 40 years. I retired 15 years ago. I did not think anyone would remember me." Catherine knelt down beside the wheelchair, bringing herself to Margaret's eye level. "Oh, we remember you very well, Mrs. Davies. Her Majesty remembers you especially. She asked me to come out here personally because she would very much like to see you, if you feel well enough for a short visit." The younger woman, whose name was Sarah, Margaret's granddaughter, could not believe what she was hearing. "Are you saying the Queen wants to see my grandmother?" "Inside the palace?" "That is exactly what I'm saying," Catherine replied, standing up and gesturing toward the open gates. "We would be honored if you would both join us. The Queen is having a small family gathering this afternoon, but she has asked that you join her for tea first. Just the three of you in her private sitting room." Thomas, still standing at attention, felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. His gamble had paid off. The Queen had responded exactly as he had hoped she would. He maintained his rigid posture, but inside he was smiling. Marcus, who had returned to his position, gave the tiniest nod of acknowledgement. They had done the right thing. Sarah was overwhelmed, trying to process what was happening. "But grandmother is not feeling well. We just came to see the palace one last time. We did not expect anything like this. She is not dressed for meeting the Queen. Neither am I." Catherine placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "You're both dressed perfectly fine. Her Majesty is not concerned about formality right now. She simply wants to see an old friend. Please come inside. We have a wheelchair ramp and I will be with you the entire time." Margaret finally found her voice, though it shook with emotion. "I cannot believe this is happening. I have dreamed of seeing her one more time, but I never thought it would be possible. Sarah, this is real, is it not? I am not imagining this?" Sarah bent down and hugged her grandmother tightly. "It is real, Gran. It is really happening." She looked up at Catherine with tears in her own eyes. "Thank you. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to us." As Catherine began to escort them through the gates, Margaret turned her head to look at Thomas. Their eyes met for just a brief moment. In that moment, no words were needed. Margaret's expression said everything. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for caring." Thomas gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was the smallest gesture, but it meant the world. The small group disappeared inside the palace grounds, and the gates closed behind them. The tourists who had witnessed the entire scene stood in stunned silence for a moment, before erupting in excited chatter. Phones came out as people texted friends and family about what they had just seen. Some recorded videos explaining the incredible moment. Within hours, the story would begin spreading on social media, but for now it was still a private miracle. Inside the palace, Sarah pushed her grandmother's wheelchair along the pristine corridors. Margaret kept touching the walls, the paintings, the furniture, as if to confirm they were real. "I used to walk these halls every morning at 5 o'clock, she whispered. "I would arrive before dawn to start preparing breakfast. The kitchen was my kingdom. I knew every pot, every pan, every recipe by heart." Catherine smiled warmly. "Many of your recipes are still used today, Mrs. Davies. Did you know that? Your scone recipe is still the standard in our kitchen. And your marmalade. The Queen still asks for it specifically." Margaret's eyes widened. "My marmalade? After all these years? I cannot believe it." They arrived at a set of elegant double doors. Catherine knocked gently, then opened them. The room inside was beautiful but comfortable, filled with natural light from tall windows. It was decorated with family photographs, fresh flowers, and well-loved books. This was not a formal throne room or state chamber. This was a home. Queen Eleanor stood near the window wearing a simple lavender dress. She was 83 years old, elegant and poised, but there was nothing cold or distant about her expression. When she saw Margaret, her face lit up with genuine warmth and joy. She crossed the room quickly, her hands outstretched. "Margaret," the Queen said softly, taking both of Margaret's hands in her own. "My dear, dear Margaret, how wonderful to see you again." Margaret tried to compose herself, to remember the proper protocols, to address the Queen correctly, but all she could do was cry. "Your Majesty," she managed to say between sobs. "I am so sorry. I am making a terrible mess of this." "Nonsense," Queen Eleanor said firmly but kindly. She pulled up a chair and sat right beside the wheelchair, still holding Margaret's hands. "You are not making a mess of anything. You are here, and I am so happy to see you. Do you know how many mornings I have thought about your cooking, about your kindness? You made my mornings brighter for 40 years, Margaret." 40 years. Sarah stood to the side, not knowing where to look or what to do. Catherine gestured for her to sit on the nearby sofa, offering her a tissue for her own tears. This was an extraordinary moment, and everyone in the room felt its weight and beauty. Queen Eleanor noticed Sarah and smiled. "And you must be family. Granddaughter?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Sarah said, standing quickly and attempting an awkward curtsy. "I am Sarah. This is my grandmother's last wish, to see the palace one more time. She has been very ill." The Queen's expression grew serious but remained compassionate. "I am so glad you brought her, and I am glad my guards had the wisdom and heart to let me know you were here. They broke protocol today, but they did so for the right reasons. That is what matters most." Margaret wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "The young guard who called out to us, he was so kind. He saved this moment for me." "He did indeed," Queen Eleanor agreed. "And I shall make sure he knows how grateful I am. Now let us have tea together, shall we? And you must tell me everything about your life since you retired. I want to hear all about your family, your days, everything." Catherine quietly excused herself to arrange for tea, leaving the three women in the sitting room. Queen Eleanor did not return to a formal chair or create any distance between herself and Margaret. Instead, she remained close, genuinely interested in reconnecting with someone who had been part of her daily life for so many years. "Tell me, Margaret," the Queen began, "what made you decide to come back today, after 15 years? Margaret took a shaky breath. Sarah reached over and squeezed her hand, giving her strength. "Your Majesty, I have been ill for some time now. The doctors say I have perhaps a few months left. I wanted to see this place one more time. I wanted to remember the happiest years of my life. Working here was not just a job. It was an honor. It was family." The Queen's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she maintained her composure with the grace that came from decades of public life. "You gave so much to us, Margaret. I remember when my children were young, you would always sneak them extra biscuits. You thought I did not notice, but I did. I never said anything because it made them so happy. Margaret laughed through her tears. They were such lovely children. I watched them grow up, at least from my place in the kitchen. Prince Edward would sometimes come down in the mornings looking for pastries. He always said mine were better than any fancy restaurant. They were, Queen Eleanor confirmed with a smile. They still are. Your recipes live on in this palace, Margaret. But more than that, your kindness lives on. The way you treated everyone, from the newest kitchen assistant to the highest officials with the same respect and warmth, that taught us all something important. Sarah listened in amazement. She had always known her grandmother had worked at the palace, but hearing the Queen herself speak about Margaret this way made her see her grandmother in a new light. This was not just any cook or kitchen worker. This was someone who had touched the lives of the royal family in meaningful ways. A knock at the door announced the arrival of tea. Catherine returned with a trolley, but she was not alone. Behind her came 2 other staff members, both women in their 60s. When they saw Margaret, they rushed forward with exclamations of joy. "Mrs. Davies, is it really you?" one of them cried. Her name was Patricia, and she had started working in the palace kitchen as a young assistant when Margaret was head cook. "Margaret, oh my goodness," the other woman, Helen, exclaimed. "We heard you were here, but we could hardly believe it." Queen Eleanor stood and gestured for them to come in. "I took the liberty of inviting some of your old colleagues, Margaret. I hope you do not mind. They insisted on seeing you." Margaret was laughing and crying at the same time now. Patricia and Helen hugged her carefully, mindful of her frailty but unable to contain their excitement. They began talking all at once, sharing memories, asking about her health, telling her how much she had been missed. The sitting room, which had been quiet and intimate moments before, was now filled with warmth and laughter. Catherine served tea and the scones that were made from Margaret's own recipe. When Margaret took a bite, she closed her eyes and smiled. "Still perfect," she whispered, "just as I taught you." For the next hour they sat together, these women from different worlds connected by years of shared work and mutual respect. Queen Eleanor did not act superior or distant. She sat among them as an equal, sharing her own memories of palace life, asking questions, and genuinely listening to the answers. Margaret told stories about the early morning chaos in the kitchen, about preparing state banquets, about the time a visiting dignitary requested a special dish and Margaret had to improvise with only an hour's notice. The Queen remembered that dinner and laughed, adding her own perspective from the dining room while Margaret had been sweating in the kitchen. "You never let us down," Queen Eleanor said seriously. "Not once in 40 years. That kind of dedication and excellence is rare, Margaret. I want you to know how deeply it was appreciated, even if I did not say it enough at the time." Margaret shook her head. "You always said thank you, Your Majesty. Every single morning. You never forgot. That meant everything to me. It made me feel seen, valued. So many people in my position feel invisible, but you always made sure I knew I mattered." Sarah, watching this exchange, felt her heart swell with pride for her grandmother. She had brought Margaret here today thinking it would be a sad goodbye to a place she loved. Instead, it had turned into a celebration, a recognition of a life well lived and relationships that had meant something real. As the afternoon wore on, Queen Eleanor checked her watch discreetly. She had the family gathering scheduled soon, but she did not want to rush this moment. However, she also knew that Margaret was tiring. Despite her joy, the elderly woman was clearly exhausted from the emotion and excitement of the day. "Margaret," the Queen said gently, "I know you must be getting tired. But before you go, I want to give you something. Would you permit me? Your Majesty, you have already given me so much today, more than I ever dreamed possible." The Queen stood and walked to a desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. When she returned, she knelt down beside Margaret's wheelchair once again, opening the box to reveal a beautiful silver pin in the shape of the royal crest. "This pin is given to those who have served the royal household with exceptional dedication and honor," Queen Eleanor explained. "I should have given this to you when you retired, but somehow the moment passed in the busy transition. I would like to give it to you now if you will accept it." Margaret stared at the pin, her mouth open in shock. "Your Majesty, I do not deserve such an honor. I was just a cook. I only did my job. You were never just a cook, Margaret. You were part of our family. You helped raise my children by feeding them with love every morning. You supported this household through countless events, challenges, and changes. You deserve this honor and so much more. The Queen carefully pinned it to Margaret's dress. There, now it is official. The room erupted in applause. Patricia and Helen were crying openly now. Catherine stood in the corner, dabbing at her own eyes with a handkerchief. Sarah wrapped her arms around her grandmother from behind, resting her cheek on top of Margaret's head. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, touching the pin with trembling fingers. "Thank you for everything. For this day. For these memories. For making my last wish come true." Queen Eleanor stood and placed her hand gently on Margaret's shoulder. "It is I who should be thanking you. Now, I believe there are two very kind guards outside who would appreciate knowing how much their actions meant today. Shall we let them know?" Outside, Thomas and Marcus had finished their shift, but both had lingered nearby, curious and anxious about what had happened after Margaret had been invited inside. They had changed out of their ceremonial uniforms into regular guard attire, but they had not left the grounds. They needed to know if they had made the right choice, if their breach of protocol had resulted in something good, or if they would face consequences. The head of Palace Security, Commander Richard Patterson, had called Thomas and Marcus into his office shortly after their shift had ended. Both guards had walked down the corridor with heavy hearts, certain they were about to be reprimanded or worse. Breaking protocol was a serious offense, and they had done so in full view of tourists and cameras. Commander Patterson was a stern man in his late 50s, a former military officer who ran the palace security with precision and discipline. He had been sitting behind his desk when they entered, his expression unreadable. Thomas and Marcus had stood at attention, preparing for the worst. "Sit down, both of you," Patterson had said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. This was unusual. Formal reprimands were typically delivered while guards remained standing. The two men exchanged confused glances but sat as ordered. Patterson had leaned back in his chair, studying them for a long moment. "Do you understand what you did today was a breach of protocol?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied immediately. "I take full responsibility. Marcus was only following my lead." "That is not entirely true, sir," Marcus interjected. "I understood what Thomas was trying to do and I supported it. We both made the decision." Patterson had nodded slowly. "I see. And you both know that protocol exists for important reasons. The image of the Royal Guard is built on discipline, tradition, and unwavering commitment to duty." "We understand, sir," both men had said in unison. Then something unexpected had happened. Commander Patterson's stern expression had softened, and the hint of a smile had appeared at the corner of his mouth. "That being said, protocol is meant to serve the royal family, not to prevent acts of basic human decency. What you did today reminded me why I am proud to serve here. You saw someone who needed help, someone who had devoted her life to this palace, and you acted with compassion." Thomas and Marcus had stared at him in shock, hardly daring to believe what they were hearing. "Her Majesty has been informed of the entire situation," Patterson had continued. "She wanted me to tell you personally that she is not only grateful for your actions, but also impressed by your judgment. You saw what others might have missed, and you had the courage to act on it. That takes wisdom, not just training." The relief that had washed over both guards in that moment was overwhelming. They were not in trouble. They had not dishonored their positions. Instead, they were being commended. "However," Patterson had added, his expression becoming serious again, "I cannot simply ignore a breach of protocol, even one done with good intentions. So here is what I am going to do. I'm writing both of you up for leaving your posts and breaking the silence protocol. This will go in your official records." The brief hope had deflated slightly, but both men had nodded, accepting the consequences of their actions. "But," Patterson had continued, and that hint of a smile had returned, "I am also recommending both of you for commendation for exceptional judgment and service. Her Majesty has specifically requested to meet with you both after her family gathering concludes this afternoon. She wants to thank you personally." Now, several hours later, Thomas and Marcus waited nervously in a small anteroom near the Queen's private chambers. They had been waiting for about 20 minutes, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. Meeting the Queen in an official capacity was one thing, but being summoned for a private audience was entirely different. The door opened, and Catherine Mills appeared. "The Queen will see you now, gentlemen. Please follow me." They walked through the same corridors that Margaret had traveled earlier that day. though they did not know the details of what had transpired during that visit. They only knew that their actions had resulted in something positive, something meaningful. Catherine opened the door to the sitting room, and both guards stepped inside. Queen Eleanor was seated in her chair by the window, the late afternoon light casting a warm glow across the room. She looked tired but happy, as if she had just experienced something deeply satisfying. Both guards immediately bowed. "Your Majesty," they said respectfully. "Please come in and sit down," Queen Eleanor said, gesturing to the chairs across from her. "I will not keep you long, as I know you have both had a long day. But I wanted to speak with you personally about what happened this morning." Thomas and Marcus sat carefully on the edge of the chairs, back straight, hands folded in their laps. Years of military and guard training made it impossible for them to relax completely, even when invited to do so. "What you did today," the Queen began, looking at each of them in turn, "was technically against protocol. I understand that. I also understand why protocol exists and why it is important. However, what you demonstrated today was something that cannot be taught through training manuals. You showed compassion, awareness, and excellent judgment." Thomas found his voice, though it was somewhat shaky. "Your Majesty, we only wanted to help. We saw a woman who had clearly served this household with dedication, and it seemed wrong to let her leave without acknowledging that somehow." "You did exactly the right thing," Queen Eleanor assured him. "Do you know what happened after you called for that message to be sent inside?" Both guards shook their heads. They had been left wondering all day, hoping they had not caused any problems or embarrassment. The Queen smiled warmly. "Margaret Davies, the woman you helped this morning, had worked in our kitchens for 40 years. She retired 15 years ago, and I am ashamed to admit that I did not give her the farewell she deserved. Life became busy, transitions happened, and somehow the moment passed without proper recognition. Today, because of your kindness and attention, I was given the opportunity to correct that mistake." She went on to describe the afternoon tea, the reunion with old colleagues, and the joy that had filled the room. She told them about the pin she had awarded Margaret, about the stories that had been shared, and about how much the visit had meant to everyone involved. "Margaret is very ill," the Queen said, her voice becoming softer. "This may well have been her last visit to the palace. You gave her and me a gift today. You gave us closure, recognition, and a beautiful memory. That is worth more than any protocol." Marcus, who rarely spoke unless necessary, found himself saying, "We are honored to have been able to help, Your Majesty. When we saw her looking at the palace with such love and sadness, we could not just stand there and do nothing. And that is precisely why you are excellent guards," Queen Eleanor replied. "True service is not just about following rules. It is about understanding the spirit behind those rules, and knowing when compassion should guide your actions. My husband, before he passed, used to say that the best servants are those who serve with both discipline and heart. You demonstrated both today." She stood, and both guards immediately rose to their feet. From a side table, she picked up 2 small boxes. These contain medals for exceptional service. They are typically reserved for guards who have served for 20 years or more, or who have demonstrated extraordinary courage in the line of duty. "I believe your actions today qualify as the latter." Thomas and Marcus were speechless as she handed them each a box. Inside was a silver medal with the royal crest, hanging from a deep blue ribbon. They had both dreamed of earning such recognition someday, but never imagined it would come like this. "Wear them with pride," Queen Eleanor said, "and know that you have my deepest gratitude and respect. You reminded me today that the people who protect and serve this household are not just performing duties. You are preserving what truly matters: human connection, kindness, and dignity." The story of what happened that Tuesday morning did not stay contained within the palace walls for long. Several tourists had recorded video of Thomas breaking protocol to call out to Margaret, and by that evening, the footage had been posted on social media. Within hours, it had gone viral, spreading across the globe with surprising speed. The video showed Thomas standing at rigid attention, then the slight turn of his head, and his voice calling out to the elderly woman in the wheelchair. The clip ended with Margaret and Sarah being escorted through the palace gates. The caption read, "Royal Guard breaks 200-year protocol to help elderly visitor. Restored my faith in humanity." Comments flooded in from around the world. People were moved by the small gesture of kindness, by the sight of someone choosing compassion over rigid rules. Many shared their own stories of times when someone had gone beyond their duty to help them. Others praised the royal guards for being human underneath their ceremonial uniforms. By the next morning, major news outlets had picked up the story. Reporters camped outside the palace hoping to learn more details. The palace press office was inundated with requests for information about what had happened. At first, the official response was simply that a former staff member had been invited for a private visit, and that the matter was personal. But as the story continued to grow, and as more people expressed their admiration for the guards' actions, the palace decided to release a more detailed statement. The Queen herself had insisted on it. She wanted the world to know the full story, to understand that this was not just about breaking protocol but about recognizing service and showing gratitude. The official statement explained that Margaret Davies had worked at the palace for 40 years, that she had been invited for tea with the Queen, and that the guards who facilitated the meeting had been commended for their judgment and compassion. The statement emphasized that while protocol was important, human kindness and recognition of service were equally valued within the royal household. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Newspapers ran headlines like, "The guards who put humanity first," and "Royal compassion, when breaking rules means doing right." Television programs invited etiquette experts and former royal staff to discuss the balance between tradition and compassion. The story resonated with people because it was simple, genuine, and deeply human. Thomas and Marcus found themselves suddenly famous, though they were deeply uncomfortable with the attention. They had not acted seeking recognition or praise. They had simply done what felt right in the moment. Now reporters wanted interviews, people recognized them on the street, and their phones were constantly ringing with messages from old friends and family members who had seen the news. The other royal guards had mixed reactions. Some were supportive and congratulated Thomas and Marcus for their commendation. Others were more critical, worried that the incident would lead to a relaxation of standards or that tourists would now expect guards to break protocol regularly. There were debates in the guardhouse about where the line should be drawn between duty and compassion. Commander Patterson addressed these concerns in a meeting with all the guards. What happened was exceptional because it was appropriate to the circumstances, he explained. Thomas and Marcus recognized a unique situation involving someone who had genuinely served this household. They did not break protocol lightly or for trivial reasons. That is the key difference. Discipline remains essential, but we must also train ourselves to recognize when human compassion should take precedence. Meanwhile, at a small house on the outskirts of London, Margaret was experiencing her own form of unexpected fame. Sarah's phone had been ringing constantly with calls from journalists wanting to interview her grandmother. At first, they had declined all requests, wanting to keep the experience private and sacred. But eventually, they agreed to one television interview, hoping it might bring closure to the media attention. The interview took place in Margaret's sitting room, surrounded by family photos and mementos from her years of service. She sat in her favorite chair wearing the silver pin the Queen had given her, speaking slowly but clearly about her experience. The interviewer, a kind woman named Jennifer, asked gentle questions and gave Margaret plenty of time to answer. "When that guard called out to us, what did you feel?" Jennifer asked. Margaret smiled, her eyes growing misty. "I felt seen. After 15 years away, after feeling like perhaps my service had been forgotten, someone noticed me. Someone cared enough to break the rules for me. That young man gave me something precious. He gave me recognition. And meeting the Queen again, what was that like?" "It was like coming home," Margaret said softly. She remembered me. Not just my name, but me. She remembered my recipes, my kindness to her children, the little moments that I thought no one had noticed. She made me feel like my life had mattered, like my work had meant something beyond just preparing meals. The interviewer then surprised everyone by revealing that Thomas and Marcus had agreed to appear via video call. Their faces appeared on a screen in Margaret's sitting room, both looking slightly awkward but smiling warmly. "Mrs. Davies," Thomas said, "Marcus and I have wanted to reach out to you since that day. But we did not want to intrude on your privacy. We just wanted you to know that meeting you, even briefly, reminded us why we do this job. You served with honor for 40 years, and we were privileged to play a small part in your story." Margaret pressed her hand to her heart, tears rolling down her cheeks. "You dear boys, you gave me the most beautiful gift. You reminded me that kindness still exists in this world. that people still care about doing the right thing even when it is difficult. I will treasure that memory for whatever time I have left. Marcus spoke next, his voice thick with emotion. The honor was entirely ours, Mrs. Davies. You are an inspiration to all of us who serve. The interview ended shortly after, but the impact continued. The segment was replayed on news programs around the world. Clips were shared millions of times on social media. People from all walks of life were moved by the simple story of recognition, gratitude, and human connection. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to happen. The palace started receiving letters and emails from people all over the world, sharing their own stories of service workers who had gone unrecognized. Nurses, teachers, cleaners, cooks, maintenance workers, all the people who kept society functioning but rarely received acknowledgement for their contributions. Many letters included a simple request. Could the palace encourage more recognition of these invisible workers? Could this story inspire a broader movement of gratitude and acknowledgement? The Queen, deeply moved by these messages, began discussions with her staff about creating an annual recognition program for long-serving public workers across the country. What had started as one guard's spontaneous act of compassion was growing into something much larger. It was becoming a reminder that every person's contribution matters, that years of faithful service deserve recognition, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply see and acknowledge the people around us who make our lives better through their quiet dedication. Thomas and Marcus returned to their regular duties, but they carried with them a deeper understanding of what true service meant. They had learned that following rules was important, but understanding why those rules existed was even more crucial. They had learned that courage sometimes meant making yourself vulnerable by choosing kindness over protocol. 3 months after that memorable Tuesday morning on a cold December evening, Sarah received the phone call she had been dreading. Her grandmother had passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family. Margaret was 87 years old, and while her death was not unexpected, it still left an enormous hole in the hearts of everyone who loved her. The funeral was planned for the following week. Sarah expected it to be a small private affair with family and a few of Margaret's old friends from the neighborhood. She arranged for a simple service at the local church, followed by burial in the cemetery where Margaret's husband had been laid to rest 20 years earlier. 2 days before the funeral, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from the palace. Catherine Mills was on the line, her voice warm but formal. "Miss Sarah, I am calling regarding your grandmother's funeral. Her Majesty has asked if it would be appropriate for a representative from the palace to attend. The Queen wanted to pay her respects personally, but understands that her presence might create a media spectacle that would overshadow the service. Instead, she would like to send several staff members who worked with your grandmother, as well as the 2 guards who helped arrange her final visit to the palace." Sarah was stunned. Of course they would be welcome. More than welcome. My grandmother would be so honored. But are you certain? It is just a small service. It is exactly because it is a small personal service that we would like to be there, Catherine replied gently. Your grandmother was family to many of us. We would like to say goodbye properly. On the morning of the funeral, Sarah arrived at the church early to make final arrangements. As she walked up the path, she stopped in shock. The church was already filled with people, not just her family members who had arrived early, but dozens of others. Former palace staff members, many now elderly themselves, had traveled from all over to pay their respects. They wore their finest clothes and carried flowers. Patricia and Helen were there, along with several other women who had worked in the palace kitchen over the years. They hugged Sarah tightly, sharing stories about Margaret's kindness and leadership. She taught us everything, Patricia said through tears. Not just about cooking, but about dignity, about treating everyone with respect, about taking pride in our work no matter how invisible it seemed to others. Then Sarah saw Thomas and Marcus. They arrived in their formal dress uniforms, looking solemn and respectful. They approached Sarah hesitantly, not wanting to intrude but wanting to pay their respects. Thank you for coming, Sarah said, embracing each of them. Gran talked about you both constantly after that day. She called you her guardian angels. She said you gave her the perfect ending to her story. It was our privilege, Thomas replied quietly. Your grandmother's dignity and grace that day taught us more about true nobility than any royal ceremony ever could. The service was beautiful and personal. The priest, who had known Margaret for decades, spoke about her devotion to family, her commitment to service, and her unwavering kindness. Several family members shared memories and stories. Then, unexpectedly, Patricia asked if she could say a few words. She walked to the front of the church, her hands trembling slightly. "I worked under Margaret Davies for 15 years, she began. She was the finest teacher I ever had, but more importantly, she was the best person I ever knew. She treated the youngest kitchen assistant with the same respect she showed the Queen herself. She never raised her voice, never belittled anyone, never let the pressure of the job turn her bitter or mean." Patricia paused, collecting herself. In a world that often ignores the people who work behind the scenes, who prepare the meals and clean the rooms and keep everything running smoothly, Margaret stood tall. She knew her worth, and she made sure everyone who worked with her knew theirs too. That is her legacy. Not just the meals she prepared, but the dignity she brought to her work and inspired in others. There was not a dry eye in the church. Even Thomas and Marcus, trained to maintain composure in any situation, wiped tears from their cheeks. After the service, as people gathered outside the church, a palace car pulled up. Catherine Mills stepped out carrying a large wreath of white roses and lilies. Attached to it was a card written in elegant script. Sarah opened it with shaking hands and read aloud, "In memory of Margaret Davies, who served with grace, dignity, and unwavering dedication for 40 years. Your kindness enriched our lives, and your legacy continues to inspire us. With deepest gratitude and respect." Eleanor R. Catherine handed Sarah a second, smaller envelope. "Her Majesty asked me to give you this personally. It is private, for your family." That evening, after the burial and the reception, after the relatives had gone home and the house was finally quiet, Sarah sat down and opened the Queen's letter. It was handwritten on royal stationery, and Sarah read it through tears. The letter expressed the Queen's personal sorrow at Margaret's passing, her gratitude for the years of faithful service, and her admiration for the woman Margaret had been. But what struck Sarah most was the final paragraph. "Your grandmother reminded me that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or birth. It comes from how we treat others, how we approach our responsibilities, and how we make people feel in our presence. She possessed more genuine nobility than many people born into privilege. She will be deeply missed, and her example will continue to guide us." Sarah held the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and genuine emotion in every word. Her grandmother, a woman who had spent her life in a palace kitchen, had touched the heart of a queen. That meant everything. In the months and years that followed, the story of Margaret Davies and the compassionate guards who recognized her became a touchstone for discussions about service, dignity, and recognition. The Queen followed through on her plan to create an annual award for public servants who had demonstrated exceptional dedication over long careers. It was called the Margaret Davies Award for Distinguished Service, and it recognized workers from all sectors who had quietly devoted their lives to making their communities better. Thomas and Marcus continued their service as royal guards, but they approached their duty differently now. They understood that the uniform they wore represented not just tradition and discipline, but also compassion and humanity. They trained younger guards to watch for opportunities to serve beyond the strict boundaries of protocol, to remember that they were protecting and serving people, not just following rules. The viral video of Thomas breaking protocol to help Margaret was shown in training sessions for new guards, not as an example of breaking rules, but as an illustration of wise judgment. Commander Patterson would tell new recruits, "Your job is to uphold tradition and protect the royal family. But never forget that at the heart of our service is care for people. When those two values seem to conflict, remember Thomas and Margaret, and choose compassion." Years later, when Thomas retired from service after a distinguished career, he kept the medal the Queen had given him in a special place in his home. But next to it, he kept something even more precious, a photo that Sarah had sent him after Margaret's funeral. It showed Margaret on the day of her palace visit, wearing her silver pin, her face radiant with joy and gratitude. On the back of the photo, Sarah had written, "Thank you for seeing her. Thank you for caring. You gave her the ending every life of service deserves, recognition, gratitude, and love." That photo reminded Thomas of the most important lesson he had learned in all his years of service. Rules and protocols matter. Tradition and discipline matter. But what matters most is remembering that behind every uniform, every title, every role, There is a human being deserving of dignity and recognition. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply pause, look beyond the surface, and truly see the person standing in front of them. Margaret's story lived on, not because it was extraordinary in its details, but because it was extraordinary in its simplicity. It was a story about seeing and being seen, about recognition and gratitude, about the quiet dignity of a life well lived, and about the power of small acts of compassion to change everything. It reminded everyone who heard it that true nobility is measured not by crowns or titles, but by how we treat one another, especially those whose service often goes unnoticed and unappreciated. That was Margaret's gift to the world, amplified by two guards who had the wisdom and courage to break protocol for all the right reasons.